Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a good morning to everyone. I would like to say I'm most grateful and honored to be invited by the organizers of this seminar to speak on the topic of legal response, rule of law, and judicial developments in times of COVID-19 pandemic, the Malaysian experience. Ladies and gentlemen, the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic continues to take a severe economic toll and inflict considerable human suffering. Despite significant efforts coordinated at the international level by various organizations, the swift impact of the crisis has asymmetrically affected the global and local populations through continuous disruptions to our daily life. Consequently, a number of COVID-19 related restrictions and security measures are introduced by governmental bodies to mitigate the short and long-term fallout of the pandemic. Accompanied by legal developments to enable and implement them, these authorities play an essential role in maintaining order and control to limit the impact of the outbreak. However, where governments respond with an expanded role and the compelling presence of law enforcement, the struggle to uphold the rule of law will be more apparent than ever. The speech explains whether these measures can be materialized without infringing our existing rights and rule of law within the global context, and will canvass the developments on the front of the judiciary to cater to the new norms and order. Ladies and gentlemen, ever since its emergence from Wuhan, China, COVID-19 pandemic has plagued Malaysia in several waves. The first took place between the 24th of January to the 15th of February 2020, with an initial record of 22 cases, consisting mainly of infected individuals arriving from China. Less than a fortnight later, on the 27th of January 2020, we saw a second surge with an alarming increase in infections due to local community transmissions, with the highest being recorded at 277 cases. Following the second wave, drastic and immediate action was taken by the Malaysian government to limit the spread of the pandemic by declaring a movement control order, or what we call the MCO, which came into effect on the 18th until the 31st of March 2020 under our Prevention of Control of Infectious Disease Act 1988, Act 342. Subsequently, physical movements were restricted through immediate closures of schools, universities, and places of worship, as well as the banning on international travel, i.e., all implemented with the aid of the armed forces and the police. In fact, these implementations of the laws were led by the police under the Police Act. All persons residing in Malaysia, citizen or not, were obliged to abide by this order. The only exceptions were made for those listed as essential services. Ladies and gentlemen, the population of Malaysia, I'm happy to say, accepted the restrictions imposed quite willingly. Unlike countries like United States of America and certain European countries, as well as Brazil, where there have been and continue to have major by its citizens due to the restrictions implemented. I have been reading the news and following news reports as well as on the social media, and I find that this is so in so many countries. When we speak about freedom there are two freedoms that are basically affected by this COVID-19 pandemic. One is the freedom of movement, and the other is the freedom to exercise generally what they call their basic rights. For example, what they claim to be the rights not to cover their faces or to go out anytime they like to play whatever games they like in the public or indoors. I think most countries have recognized, as advised by the World Health Organization, or WHO, that wearing of masks and social distancing can substantially reduce the spread of the virus. More so now with the new strain, which spreads faster than its original cousin. Countries which impose these strict regulations seem to be more successful in containing the infection rate than those who do not comply. We can see clearly that, as I said earlier, some states in the United States, the rate of infection is much faster than other states, depending on whether the states is a Republican support or the Democrat supporting state. Now, if we accept this as the preamble to limiting the contagion effect of the virus, then why do people object against complying with these requirements? And if they do object, should they not be forced to comply with the regulations for their own good, even if it means imposing heavy deterrent sanctions? Laws, as we all know, are made for the good of the large majority, even if few do not like it. That is part of democracy. Some writers tended to suggest that it is important to adopt measures to contain COVID-19, but it must be done in a manner that is protective of essential human rights. Of course, we want to do that where possible. Our newly appointed Prime Minister, Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin, seeks to fulfill this by announcing the Movement Control Order proclaimed under the Prevention and Control of Infectious Disease Act 1988, or we call PCIDA. The police, who are essentially empowered in implementing these laws, invoke incidental powers under the Police Act 1967. During the phase of MCO, steps are taken to flatten the curve of the widespread COVID, among which are restrictions of movement, prohibiting mass gatherings involving sports, religion, social, and cultural activities. Additionally, houses of worship, business premises, as well as government and private premises were required to be closed. The exception to the rule were those designated as crucial to the livelihood of many, such as essential stores, which sell everyday necessities, and or those involved in essential services for the country, such as the supply of water, electricity, energy, telecommunication, and postal, as well as other essential services. Included in these essential services are delivery of food and essential items. They are normally called the Grab or the Uber services. The education sector is also not exempted from this series of closures and shutdowns. This includes kindergartens, public and private school, pre-university institutions, public and private higher institutions, as well as training institutions. Travel bans are issued by the Malaysian government with strict requirements under which Malaysian citizens are prohibited from traveling abroad, and Malaysians returning from overseas must undergo health checks and be quarantined for 14 days. All tourists and foreign visitors are also prohibited from entering Malaysia. The police, acting with the assistance of other law enforcement agencies like the military and the local government enforcement agencies, using the Police Act 1967, enforce these laws. This allows them to take lawful measures, including apprehending all persons whom they are by law authorized to apprehend, conducting prosecutions, and giving assistance in carrying out any law relating to revenue, excise, sanitation, quarantine, immigration, and registration. Under the PCIDA, non-compliance with the order is an offense. The offender will be fined or liable to be sent to prison. But in practice, many are just offered a compound of a maximum of 1,000 ringgit or USD $250. In view of the fact that in Malaysia, the per capita of Malaysia is only 12,000 USD, sum of 250 USD is sufficient to deter many offenders. The effect of what is normally called the lockdown, or in Malaysia we call the MCO, is its impact on the economy. That is the battle faced by many countries, if not all, in this world, whether to open the economy and risk the spread of the pandemic, or impose a lockdown and risk their population facing threat to the economic life. To some extent, this may be true. In Malaysia, what we did was, at the beginning of the economy, we closed the country from all sorts of activities for quite a long period, resulting in many, particularly those who are in the lower category income, to suffer. This has resulted in the government having to provide economic relief. But now, as we go along and we are facing the pandemic, we have learned a lesson that we don't need to close the economy completely. We merely restrict them according to areas where the risk is higher or the spread of the virus is faster, and impose conditional lockdown in other areas depending on the gravity of the problem. Now, compared to Malaysia, Singapore was earlier to pass the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act 2020, which it did as early as 7th April 2020. On the other hand, Malaysia only passed the temporary measures for government financing Coronavirus Disease Act of 2019 on August 2020. Pursuant thereto, the government had announced a number of stimulus packages, what they call the Prihatin Rakyat Economic Stimulus Package, Prihatin SME Economic Stimulus Package, and Short-Term Economic Recovery Plan. These initiatives provide aids, financial aids for citizens, such as in cases of late payment for housing loan, which is not imposed to the purchasers from 18th of March till 31st of August. I'm glad to say the financial institutions also support by allowing moratorium on repayment of debts to its customers. And even after the end of the lockdown, bankers and financial institutions were ready to listen to the problems faced by their customers, and many were prepared to refinance, to allow refinancing of the loans. Given the uncertain nature of COVID-19, our National Security Council, or the Majlis Keselamatan Negara, chaired by the Prime Minister, together with his ministers, organizes regulatory actions, risk management assessment, and risk communication to the public. The government also implemented proactive risk management border controls and travel bans, along with the economic and budgetary responses. Such rights-respecting mechanisms that seek to ensure accurate, reliable, and up-to-date information about the virus and the current situations of the country are communicated to the public in a very transparent and timely manner. In Malaysia, the minister in charge would make announcement on the national television to inform the public of the development 24 hours prior to that. And every evening, the Director General of Health will announce the number of cases that was recorded 24 hours before that. And that includes number of deaths, locality, and he is open to questions by those present at the press conference. So everybody in Malaysia knows what the development of the progress or deterioration of the spread of the virus. While Malaysia was imposing the recovery movement control order, we have also learned lessons from other countries who managed to curb the spread of the virus well. And this includes countries such as Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, and the likes. Malaysia itself learned from the earlier days of the COVID as to how restriction can be imposed. It now balances between how much the economy should be open. We now allow shops to open, but still impose restrictions regarding movements and working hours. Just like UK now imposes the 3-tier restrictions, in Malaysia, we had been doing this since a few months earlier, where we call the different restrictions by different names. For example, we have the MCO, which is the Movement Control Order, and then we have the CMCO, which is the Conditional Movement Control Order, and we have a control order which is more strict, and then finally back to the MCO, which is equivalent to the total lockdown. Now, I am now going to be bold in this presentation to suggest a rather radical idea, perhaps because Malaysia is facing a peculiar political situation and its recent experience from a state or provincial election where immediately after the election, which of course involved candidates campaigning, we are now suffering a very bad third wave. The daily figures of cases have gone up 2 to 3 times the highest figures of our second wave. Our only consolation is that the number of daily deaths are proportionately lower. Now, what had happened was, briefly, there was a tussle for the control of the government in Malaysia. This originated because the government in power today, as I'm speaking to you, was accused by other political parties of gaining power by backdoor, where the current Prime Minister went to the King and got the King to agree that to recognize that he had the majority control in Parliament and was sworn in as a Prime Minister. After that, other leaders of other political parties contested or challenged his position. And there was a risk of an election having to be conducted during this time that the country and the world is facing the pandemic. But as I speak to you today, I'm happy to say that all the leading political parties have agreed to temporarily put aside their differences and work together to fight the coronavirus. The bold idea that I want to make is whether, if in the event the country has to face a general election, which definitely, as I said, involves campaigning and voting, this will lead to wider spread, speedier spread of the virus amongst the population. Now, had there been a vote of no confidence in Parliament and an election has to be held, my idea, which is very radical, is, can Malaysia or any other country for that matter invoke the emergency powers and take over the country until the pandemic or until we find a vaccine to stop the spread of the virus? I must admit that invoking the emergency powers may be rather draconian and drastic. But if it is to be balanced against the risk of the disease spreading and causing untold damage to human beings and the economy of the country, don't you think that such an action is necessary? Under our federal constitution, the king can make a declaration of emergency in accordance with Article 150 of our federal constitution. That Article 150 reads, if the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, who is our king, is satisfied that a grave emergency exists whereby the security or the economic life or public order in the Federation or any part thereof is threatened, he may issue a proclamation of emergency, making therein a declaration to that effect. The court has held that trafficking of drugs can be a threat to public order. Now, what more is political instability? Would political instability in Malaysia lead to threat to security? The pandemic is clearly a threat to the economic life. If nobody can work, nobody can, industries cannot move, the country economically may come to a standstill. So this is where, in my opinion, the king would have that power to declare an emergency, and pursuant to that power can make an order postponing the general election until time when we have found a vaccine for the virus, or the country has got rid of the virus in some other way. But I'm happy to say, for now, we don't need to do so, since, as I said earlier, the political parties have sort of agreed that the current government will continue to rule the country. Now, let me touch a bit on the effect of the pandemic in the context of threat to the right to health. The United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Risks links the right itself to realization of other human rights. The right to health is closely related to and dependent upon the realization of other human rights as contained in the International Bill of Rights, including the rights to food, housing, work, education, human dignity, life, non-discrimination, equality, the prohibition against torture, privacy, access to information, and freedoms of association, assembly, and movement. These and other rights and freedoms address the integral components of the right to health. Public health concerns linked to SARS and H1N1 that plagued the country emerge on a more manageable scale. The MCO in Malaysia, introduced by the government as the current worldwide pandemic unfolded, now continues to be outspread, could herald tensions between the public health interests and personal rights and freedom, threatening democratic principles as the rule of law. Beyond the national sphere, authoritative guidance on government responses that limits human rights on the basis of public health of national emergency can be borrowed from the Syracuse principle adopted by the UN Economic and Social Council in 1984. The principles underline safeguards that can guide states to ensure emergency declarations and measures are not simply a disguise or cloak for repressive actions and arbitrary power against any section of the population, including the minority and vulnerable groups. Although Malaysia is not a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 1966, the following principles available under this instrument are useful to ensure Those entrusted with power to enforce public health measures adhere to our constitutional safeguards. Such measures and responses must be: 1. Issued and implemented in accordance with the law. 2. Targeted at legitimate objective of general interest. 3. Strict requirement in democratic society to meet the objective. 4. The least intrusive and restrictive available to reach the objective. 5. Based on scientific evidence and neither arbitrary nor discriminatory in application. And 6. A limited period respectful of human dignity, able to be reviewed. Quarantine and isolation are the most complex and controversial public health powers. During the time of uncertainty, the government has to take a firm decision after being informed and advised by the experts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, rule of law is a historic ideal that appeals to remain rhetorically potent. Yet, the precise meaning of the rule of law is perhaps less clear than before. Many invocations are entirely conclusory, and some are seen as mutually varied and shifting. Within the Anglo-American traditions, the rule of law ideals have been contested, with the most focused exposition coming from a turn of the century British lawyer A.V. Dicey, who associated the rule of law with right-based liberalism and judicial review of governmental action. According to Dicey, the rule of law comprises three ideals. 1. Law prevails over arbitrariness and discretionary power. 2. Every man is subject to the ordinary law of the realm and amenable to the jurisdiction of tribunals. And C. The general principles of constitution, as for example, the right to liberty or the right to public meeting, are the result of judicial decisions determining the rights of private persons in particular cases brought before the courts, rather than the result of legislation. Dicey's thoughts on these three ideals purport to show that they guarantee that everyone is subject to rules rather than person. Now, applying this to the current situation that we are facing, what the government and many other governments are doing is open to challenge under this principle of the rule of law. But as I said, I'm happy in Malaysia they have not done so. We all agree that the problem relating to the COVID-19 and the suppression or eradication of the pandemic is not the sole responsibility of the authority. It is the responsibility of all. Rule of law must be appreciated only because of formalistic reasons. The meaning of the rule of law should be connected to peace, establishment of environment that is conducive to liberty, less arbitrary, more predictable, more peremptory, and less coercive. According to Fuller, it is a bond of reciprocity, a mutuality of constraint between the ruler and the ruled. Now, I would like to touch a bit on public interest. At times, like COVID-19, public interest is paramount. The English philosopher and founder of modern utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, in commenting on public interest, explained that, quote, "It is in vain to talk of the interests of the community without understanding what is the interest of the individual. A thing is said to promote the interest or to be for the interest of an individual when it tends to add to the sum total of his pleasures, or what comes to the same thing, to diminish the sum total of his pains." In the light of the aforementioned, the MCO has been imposed by different countries, calling it by different names, brings to light principles that can be compromised and undermined, such as equality, for example, the impact of confinement and fines on economically disadvantaged groups, because a fine of 1,000 ringgit or 250 USD to one who earns more may not be as deterrent as to one who is earning less. Access to justice, for example, right to be heard and procedural technicalities, democracy and freedom, liberty and movement, accountability, for example, omissions and negligence, exposing individuals to grave health risk. While the outbreak has affected everyone, not every impact is equal. In an effort to curb the spread of virus, nations scaled down their economic activity, which may lead the world into a recession. With disruptions in every sector, the economic standstill is driving the world with varying burden across different levels of income earners. Those with lower income are most at risk due to social distancing measures and more likely to be heavily damaged by the pandemic, because those who live in the squatter areas, for example, will find difficulty in social distancing. The other topic that I want to mention very briefly is the administration of justice during this period. Judges, who are the forefront of justice, will have to put into practice the application of legal principles at its best, such as the principles of legality, proportionality, necessity, equality, and non-discrimination. Proper application of the rule of law will require both public interest and private fundamental human rights to be preserved. The public is very well aware of the basic and fundamental rights. Just to give you an idea on the perception of the public on which sector should be lifted earliest after a lockdown, I would like to quote the Portland survey of 2020. Pursuant to this survey, it was found that the British public were of opinion that the second sector to have a lockdown lifted is the courts and justice system, after food and drink. It is also predicted that the highest sector to increase in legal disputes is the airline sector. I find that the pandemic has also resulted in the expeditious increase in the use of digital system. I find that those countries which are advanced digitalization were able to face the lockdowns better than those countries which lack this system. And when we speak about digitalization, we speak about speed of internet. If the speed of internet is slow, then of course we cannot make use of digitalization well. As far as Malaysia is concerned, I'm happy to say that because of the fact that our court system had been converted into an electronic court system, we are able to cope with the problems faced as a result of the pandemic. These includes hearings of cases. Because we are rather advanced in using electronic court system, we're able to continue with the court civil and criminal case management by way of e-review or video conferencing, email, and e-filing. So because of this, our courts started hearing cases relatively early during the lockdown because cases were heard via video or online, and judges were able to hear cases even though judges and parties, lawyers, were able to hold hearings with them being in their own homes. Only criminal cases find some problem because the accused person had to be brought and face the magistrate in person. I'm also proud to say, as a Chief Justice of the Dubai International Financial Center Courts, that for the last 6 months since the start of the lockdown in various countries, we continue to hear cases with judges sitting from their homes in Australia, me in Malaysia, and lawyers arguing the cases from London, and the registry doing their work, monitoring the cases in Dubai. So the whole world is a court. And by so doing, we are able to not delay the implementation of justice. The last item that I like to mention is the challenges facing the spread of fake news. Among the legal challenges faced by the Malaysian government during the first CMO or restricted CMO was the spread of fake news in facing the COVID-19. The government had to take strict approach in dealing with the virulent spread of fake news to curb panic among the Malaysian citizens. The police and Malaysia's Communications and Multimedia Commission have opened 270 papers on fake news relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I believe this number is increasing by the day. The senior minister, Datuk Sri Ismail Sabri, said the total 133 were being investigated and 35 have been charged in court. Despite there being existing laws in dealing with fake news, it has been challenging for the government in countering the widespread of fake news, especially in the social media. We read also there's been an increase of reported cases of domestic violence because, again, this involves human rights. People living in a very small accommodations, having a number of children staying together for 24 hours cramped in that small space will definitely cause a lot of stress, which leads to domestic violence. Now, I come to the conclusion. During this time of uncertainty in facing the pandemic of COVID-19, leadership, empathy, and prompt response are needed not only from the politicians, administrators, but also from the legal fraternity in ensuring that the rule of law is being upheld not only by the members of society, but more so by those responsible in governing the country. After having put my suggestion of invoking the emergency powers, let me end by toning it down with a reminder of Lord Atkin's dicta in Liversidge against Anderson. I would like to highlight the dissenting judgment of Lord Atkin, who protested in giving an uncontrolled power of imprisonment to the minister. He said, quote, "In England, amidst the clash of arms, laws are not silent. They may be changed, but they speak the same language in law as in peace. It's always been one of the pillars of freedom, one of the principles of liberty, for which in recent authority we are now fighting, that the judges are no respecters of persons and stand between the subject and any attempted encroachments on his liberty by the executive, alert to see that any coercive action is justified in law." So, ladies and gentlemen, it now leaves us with the question, are a person's fundamental rights lost during the pandemic? There is no easy answer to this question that we are now facing at the moment. In response to a calamity, Islam teaches us to be patient with trials, as Allah mentioned in the following verse, who, when disaster strikes them, say, "Indeed, we belong to Allah, and indeed to Him we will return." In facing this unprecedented situation, and with the fear the effects are more that of the First World War and Depression time, there are lessons that can be learned as time for reflection and knowledge as a Muslim. With the advance of technology and internet, it is hoped that it may assist the humankind in facing this pandemic without ignoring the basic rule of law related to society and government. I've enjoyed speaking to you, and thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.